De la Fundación Democracia Suiza y copresidente del Foro Global de Democracia Directa Moderna, a quien damos la palabra. Adelante, Bruno Kaufmann.
Muchas gracias. Buen día, queridas damas y caballeros. Estoy muy feliz de estar aquí hoy. Por favor, discúlpeme por hablar en inglés. I'm really pleased to be here today. We have heard it. It's a good moment to discuss these issues here in Mexico and also to discuss it with a background of the Swiss experience of modern direct democracy. But the title of my introduction is, in fact, towards genuine representative democracy in Switzerland, Mexico, and beyond. And you may be surprised about that, but it's very clear to me that direct democracy is not something separate. It's part of a modern representative democracy. It's part of making representative democracy truly representative. We are not only here in Mexico in a moment of democratic, you can say, democratic revival, democratic momentum. All over the world, democracy is on the move. In ways we may sometimes not like, but it's on the move. And Ambassador Mayora already have told it. Turnouts, participation rates in elections and referendums and other types of participation are growing continuously. Last year, and you may have seen the Economist Democracy Report, was the year with the most people participating in an election or in a referendum. I'm living myself in Sweden, and we had an election in September. We had 88% turnout. It's growing, and in many countries there are more and more people participating in elections because they understand that it's now we have to participate to make our voices heard, to really make democracy working. And you had elections here, important elections. We had elections all over the world, and also in many places people could vote on issues. For instance, in Taiwan, 10 citizen-initiated referendums were in November on the ballot. But this is just the beginning. This year will be even a more participatory year. We will have the biggest election in history, in India, in Indonesia, in Europe. More people than ever will be called to the ballot stations, especially this spring. And this makes us, of course, very much thinking about, is it this kind of participation which can make democracy really working, or is there something more behind it which makes elections really powerful? And we can see that elections not always are producing good friends of democracy. We have in the recent years got, in fact, elected a lot of old-style, autocratic, not very democratic leaders. And this is, of course, a concern. It's also about the idea of populism, that it's not about voting on real issues, on policies, but on quick fixes, on shortcuts, on people to deliver quick solutions. And this is a big risk when representative democracy not really works as it should. But we have on the other side also in many countries people really actively promoting more democratic reforms. Democracies which are really embedded in a system of the rule of the law, in a system which respects human rights, but also makes participation not just a one day in 4 or 5 years event, but a daily event. And here on these pictures, you see pictures from all across the world of democratic, so-called people movements, revolutions in recent years. And looking into the experience of democracy around the world, it's also important that we not just look on nation-state level experiences. In fact, this is a picture from International IDEA State of the Democracy report, and it looks onto the local level as well, on the regional level as well. And most democratic developments recently have in fact happened on the local and regional level. And I think your experience in this country are very much a proof of that. So why Switzerland? Why is Switzerland relevant to this discussion? Switzerland is such a small country where you look onto the world map, you have really to show it very precisely. This is Switzerland. As I said, I'm living in Sweden, but I'm also a Swiss citizen, and always when I go to Switzerland and I fly into Switzerland, the last 3 minutes is Switzerland. So it's a rather small place, but it's an important place for this discussion for several reasons. I mean, we will have now, just before I left home, I got this envelope. The ambassador already explained to you that we 4 times a year get this envelope to vote on different kind of issues. And I get that in Sweden, and I get a little certificate here. So I could, in fact, now live go on the internet and vote for the next election. Referendum, which is on the planning laws. It's a citizen initiative by a small Green party, which proposed that in the constitution there are certain strict rules on how to build the country, how to zone the country. And it's a typical Swiss citizen initiative that you propose quite a radical proposal, and then there is a discussion, and normally citizen initiatives are not winning at the ballot box, but they create a debate about important issues. And that's the reason many of those citizen initiators, activists, they are far from being devastated by not winning in the referendum. Switzerland is a country of small size, but a country of long democratic history, and of course also of a variety of experiences on the local and regional level. It's always interesting to discuss these kind of reforms in different countries, because it's always the discussion about how can we devolute, how can we decentralize democracy from the top to the bottom or to the local and regional levels. And Switzerland, you can say, as an exemption of the rule, has never had a king, has never had a dictator, has never had a unified a central power who could assume so much power that it had to be decentralized. You see here the 26 states of Switzerland. They are of very different size. The biggest one has 1.3 million inhabitants, Zurich, and not far from there you can see small states like Appenzell-Innerrhoden with 16,000 people, or Uri with 25,000. So there is a big difference of size and experiences, and this is also influencing the issue of democracy and of direct democracy. In fact, and that's a very interesting matter of fact, Switzerland didn't invent the referendum and direct democracy. Direct democracy invented Switzerland. And that's, for historic reasons, a very interesting pattern. Because, of course, you can say that there is a 700 years history of local entities unifying into a common state. But the factor of modern direct democracy was not part of this history as much as, of course, assemblies and people discussing issues, bringing back issues to their valleys. But the very idea of modern direct democracy was invented during the French Revolution and in the United States. And it was, in fact, also an invader, Mr. Napoleon Bonaparte, who brought the first national referendum to Switzerland in 1802. But it was a fake referendum. It was a referendum where the people could say yes or no to the constitution of Mr. Bonaparte, and the yes had about 30%. The yes had about 70%. The no about 30%, and especially Mr. Bonaparte said it was 30% yes, 70% no, but Bonaparte said it's adopted because those who were not participating, they said yes. So that was a bad idea to establish the idea, but it was through that it was established as an idea on the national level in Switzerland, because it was also the first constitution on a Swiss base, and it took another 46 years until in 1848, the first successful or the only successful democratic revolution in Switzerland created the Swiss modern federal state with a constitution adopted by the people themselves. And that was a very important factor, because out of that the principle was born that no constitutional change in Switzerland can be made without a majority of the people and a majority of the states, which means that you count the votes 2 times. You count the votes as such on the national level, and you also count the votes in every state. That means even the smallest state have a stronger voice than the biggest one. So that means you need a double majority to adopt and to amend the Swiss constitution. And this is a quite, let's say, a high hurdle, which gives voters in small states, in a way, more power than in big states. But it has been the key to keep the country together, because it's not just a simple majority, it's also about the federal idea of a state where the states have a lot of sovereignty, where the local level has a lot of sovereignty. This has been a very successful one. But for instance, as the ambassador has said, when we voted in 2002 on membership in the United Nations, I still remember I was sitting and following the results. It was a clear yes in the popular vote, but it was a very close race, just one state more than enough to get a double majority vote. So this has been very often discussed, and I think still today there is a consensus that this is a good thing, because direct democracy is not just about winning or losing. It's not just about majority and minority. It's really about the cohesion of a country, that you continuously discuss issues together so you can accept also to lose. Now, when Switzerland was established in 1848 as a modern country, there was not something like we call today direct democracy, more than the mandatory referendum on the constitutional change. But there was one party ruling, there was a government with just one party, and all the other parties were outside. It was basically a classical indirect democracy. And it took another 30, 40, 50 years to introduce new forms of legislation, which means that the people had the right also to vote on legislation, and the people had the right to propose amendments to the constitution. It was in 1874 that the democratic movement in especially urban areas created the momentum to change the constitution in favor of introducing the so-called popular referendum. And this is the right of the people to have a say on new legislation. It's a check of the people on parliament. And this is a very powerful check on democracy, because it gives the citizens, today it's 50,000 citizens, to check the adoption of a new law and to bring it to the people. But normally, and that's very interesting in the Swiss case, about only 2 out of 100 laws are put to a referendum, because in 98 cases, Parliament does such a good job that you don't find 50,000 people to put it to a referendum. And this is, I would say, one of the key arguments why direct democracy, modern direct democracy, makes representative democracy more representative, because the representatives have to be in continuous exchange with the population as such. They have to legislate in a way that the legislation written into the law is understandable to everybody. So there's a lot of efforts today in Switzerland to make legislation as understandable, as simple, as accessible as possible, because if people don't understand, if you get the new law in your hands and you don't understand what they say, you would probably say no instead of yes. So there's a big interest in make a clear language, and because we have 4 national languages and the legal language must be equal in all of these 4 national languages, there's a lot of efforts, a lot of administrative support for this kind of good legislation. That's the one aspect. The second aspect is the citizen initiative for changes on constitution. And this is also important, that the people as such cannot propose new legislation in Switzerland. They can only propose new amendments or new articles in the constitution. And the idea of that is, of course, that the constitution is the most important document in politics and in the Swiss political system. And that's the issue of the people themselves, because the people are the highest authority for democracy. They are the ones to propose and to make decisions on constitutional issues. And the parliament, on its side, has a little bit less power, but does the most work about legislation. And the people have just a check on it. They can just bring it to a vote, but most legislation is done in parliament, like in most countries. And the government in itself is, of course, you can say in the hierarchy of sovereignty on the third level, but has the most, of course, regulative powers, the most executive powers. But it's important to see this pyramid is not that the top has most power and the bottom has the least. It's vice versa. The people has the most and the government has the least. But in a way, it's a balance of legislation and executive power. And the citizen initiatives, in a way, are the way to bring new ideas into the political system. Now, I myself, when I was a very young student, I was involved in a citizen initiative in Switzerland in the end of the 80s. We proposed simply that the Swiss army should be abolished. And that wasn't the most popular thing you can say with the establishment. But we also understood that there will not be a yes vote for that, because it was really questioning a real foundation and, of course, also important issue of the Swiss system. But we got a discussion about how to defend our country, how to set up an army in the 21st century when a country is like surrounded by friends like the European Union. So we got a big debate and we got much more yes votes than expected. So we were really happy losers. And we understood that citizen initiatives are much more about creating a dialogue and to be taken seriously, even if you are a total outsider, that this makes democracy stronger and you can learn from each other. And that's many times the case in this kind of initiatives. It's also important to say that the citizen initiative in Switzerland is a very different process from the referendum. A referendum you have to put forward within 100 days of the legislation adoption. So it's a very, you can say, a quick way of check the balance after it. But the citizen initiative is a process of many years. For instance, the citizen initiative for Switzerland without an army, this was a process started in 1983 and the vote was in 1989. So it was 6 years of work. And many times it's even longer afterwards because you have to implement or not implement, you can to follow up. So having a citizen initiative is really being part of the process for many years, and that creates, of course, a way of giving time and space to the citizens and their proposals, and on the other side also the political system. Because I think that's the other very important factor of the Swiss system, is that direct democracy in Switzerland is in fact an invitation for conversation. That means if a citizen initiative is put forward, the parliament and the government, they can make their discussions, they can make their recommendations, and then they can even make a counter-proposal, which means many times when there is a citizen initiative, the government and the parliament would agree that this is an issue of concern, for instance, on environmental issues, on energy, on many other issues, and they say, but the proposal put forward by the citizens is far too radical. It's not helpful. So we propose you another solution, which is less radical. And on this way, you can create consensus, as also the ambassador has underlined initially, because in the end, and that's also important, you have always a popular vote. It's never like that the government could just say, we don't bring this to the vote. The government neither can just put a question forward. So it's not possible for the government in Switzerland to just propose an issue for a consulta, for a referendum, or for a ballot. It's only the law and the people who can do that. And the government has, of course, many opportunities to put forward their proposal. And in the end, and that's a new thing in the last 20, 30 years, in the end, Switzerland, the citizens can vote on the citizen initiative at the same time on the counter-proposal. And they can vote yes to one and yes to two. And then you have a third question, because you need something which is adopted as the new law, as the new constitutional amendment, and then you have a decisive question. So through that system, which has been a learning process, because before it was like that the citizen initiatives would be met by counter-proposals in order to kill the citizen initiative, because you couldn't then get majorities. So now we have a system which learned out of that, and we get a solution which is no to everything, which is a yes to one of the solutions, or even yes to both, but then you get this decisive question, and that makes this kind of direct democracy very productive, and in the end also legitimate for everybody. Now, again, you can say, how does Swiss direct democracy relate to the indirect, to the parliamentary democracy? And that's exactly what I already started to tell, that in Switzerland, direct democracy is not a separate process. It's a process enshrined in the representative system, which is making the dialogue between people and their representatives and their government a continuous process. There are many, let's say, funny quotes about that, but one I think is very important, who was coming from a very critical author in Switzerland, Friedrich Dürrenmatt. He wasn't a big fan of the Swiss politics and the Swiss society as such, but he said, the beauty of the Swiss system is that you have 3 times a year a conversation how you want to have it together. He even said Switzerland is a prison, but it's a nice prison because the prisoners are discussing how they want to equip their prison, and they don't know who is the gardener and who are the prisoners. Now we have elections this year as well in Switzerland, and these elections are in October, and it's important to say that direct democracy and indirect democracy and election in Switzerland, they play together, but they are not mixed up. When you have an election in Switzerland, you don't at the same time have a vote on an issue. And this is because to avoid that direct democracy is too much misused by political parties, by political interests, and by electoral agendas. So when we have the election, we don't vote on issues. But on the other side, when we don't have elections, we have 3 and 4 times a year, we have these votes on the different issues. But it's important also to say that elections in Switzerland are, of course, still very important because the parliament, as I have said, is responsible to bring through 98% of the legislation, and it's also important how the government looks like. And this is another important factor because direct democracy has been the way to integrate the minorities in Switzerland. The Swiss modern state was established on a small, rather peaceful civil war in 1946-47 between the Protestant and the Catholic cantons. And at that time, the general of the Protestants, he said, to his soldiers, don't kill the Catholic soldiers because we have to live together with them in the future. So it has been called the most civil war and maybe a good precondition for starting a democracy. But yet, direct democracy has been the way to integrate different interests, urban areas, different kind of beliefs, of languages as well, as we have 4 languages, and that's very much an important factor. Now, talking about that in these terms is, of course, in a way interesting. It's in a way useful, but as it has already been said as well, it's of course not possible to just use a good experience and to transport it to another place on the world and to just establish it as such. It's really a long story. It has to do with many fights. I must also say, I mean, Swiss direct democracy has also had its backside. When I was born, my mother hadn't a voting right because the man hadn't given the women in the voting rights. And that's just 50 years ago. So Swiss direct democracy is a continuous learning process. It's also a mirror of the society, and that's also important. Democracy and direct democracy is not a better world. It's just a finer mirror of your society, and you see what's not good, where are the conflicts. It's not a system of total peace. It's more a way of making conflicts more peaceful. And in that way, I think our discussion here today is very important because we can start to discuss really the preconditions, also the limits and options of direct democracy in 2 countries, in the case of Switzerland and in Mexico, which is in a way have a lot of similarities when it comes both to the history but also to the federative structure of the state, the idea of that not everything is decided on the central level, and of course also the multicultural aspect of a country, that you don't need a nation, one language, one people, one belief. It's really just the idea of a modern republic where the citizens, the active citizens, are the one to make decisions. And I've been here now for a few days, already learned and met many of you to discuss the idea of a more participatory democracy. We also heard about that there are plebiscites and referendums coming up in different parts. And I think it's the momentum of discussing that. And the key point for the success of a modern direct democracy as part of representative democracy is very clearly the design of the tools of direct democracy. It's really important how you design them. One aspect I already named, the question of plebiscites from the top, or as you call the consultas, the right for the elected leaders to use direct democratic processes to in a way, make people participating. In a Swiss perspective, but also in an international perspective, I would say this is a very problematic way of using direct democracy because it's namely in the interest of those who are already in power. Direct democracy should be the right for those who are not in power, those who are the minorities, those who are not already established parties, to use it, and the people as such, of course. And there's a big risk, and we have a historic record of fake, you can say, direct democracy used by dictators, by more or less democratic leaders, but also in democratic countries there's a risk of this plebiscitarian top-down idea. And in Switzerland we have really made experience that you should go the other way, and that's a successful way because you know as a citizen that you are not played with. There's nobody who can just manipulate your vote. There's nobody who just makes what he or she wants with your decision. And this a little agenda shows you also a little bit of the stability of the Swiss direct democracy. We already know that we, on the 26th September of 2038, will have a national vote. This is the calendar you can plan if you want to go to holidays or if you do it on the internet. So it's a very stable calendar of direct democracy, and I think that's a very important factor. No government can influence if these dates are there or not. That's a calendar which everybody knows and everybody agrees to. Now, there are options and there are limits of direct democracy, obviously, and we know them in Switzerland also quite clearly. I already named some big problem we had and we have, is that those in power are, of course, those who make the decisions also about those who are not in power or those who have not voting rights. That was for a long time the problem with the male and the female vote, because the male had about 3 votes in order to let the vote of the female to the vote. And this is a little bit the dilemma we have in all democracies, that the insiders and the outsiders. We have it today with the fact that 25% of the Swiss inhabitants are not Swiss voters, are not Swiss citizens. And it's very hard. Certain canton states have introduced the vote for foreigners, others not. So we have a continuous debate about the integrative factor of direct democracy. We have also a big discussion about how to interrelate with international law. We had just a few months ago a very important vote about who has the primacy of legislation in Switzerland. Certain circles with a citizen initiative wanted to change the current hierarchy, that international law adopted by the Swiss voters should not be accepted as that, but you should have just national law which is over international law. And that would, of course, have questioned a lot of the foundations of the modern Swiss state. And luckily, a big majority of the Swiss voters voted against this citizen initiative. We had also last year an interesting vote about the public broadcasting system. I'm myself a journalist for the Swiss public broadcasting companies in 30 years. And we had a vote that also, again, a citizen initiative proposed to abolish the fee of $500 a year per household for the broadcasting. And again, you would have expected, yeah, that's $500, why should you pay that? But 70% of the people said, we want to keep it because it's important for democracy. And this brings us to the issue of an infrastructure for direct democracy. You can say when you have more direct democracy, you need also an infrastructure for it. That means you need tools and support for citizens to do it. I mean, we have this booklet coming out 4 times a year, which is a very popular one, which is very, very well read in 4 languages, which is part of this infrastructure, but only developed in the last 20, 30 years. Before, there wasn't anything like that. We have the e-voting system, which is very important, especially for Swiss like me, which are not living in Switzerland. And we have the big debate about money and democracy in Switzerland. As you know, Switzerland is not a very poor country, and it's only recently that we got a discussion about how money influences direct democracy. And transparency in our political system is still very limited, and other countries we can learn a lot from. Now, democracy is, as it has been said, and I will soon end, democracy is a puzzle, is a mosaic, is a system of many different aspects. So it's not just about introducing direct democracy and then you have fixed all your problems. I think what you are discussing in Mexico just now is really the fundamental issue of participation of the citizens in the political system. And you cannot limit that to just election day every 6 years. And the second very important factor also on a global level is how democracy is evolving and developing on the local level, the cities. I have just experienced a few very interesting days here in Mexico City, and I see how powerful the idea of more local participative democracy is. And I think that's the driving force in most places around the world where national levels have big problems. The locals are doing very well. So in concluding, our big challenge all over the world today is that we have too long time limited representative democracy to representative government, which means giving away your vote and then waiting for the next vote. This is a system which is not accepted and not purposeful anymore today. We have to aim for genuine representative democracy, and that means we have to overcome the paternalistic nature of our government systems, which are mismatching with our modern societies of informed citizens, of citizens who are caring about their lives and their communities. And in that way, I think what we are seeing all over the world in different ways, we see developments towards a more direct democracy, but also more digital democracy, more local democracy, and even more transnational democracy. This is mostly seen in Europe, but also in other parts of the world where the globalization leads to the factor that we need to aim for participative tools also on that level. So, to conclude, modern direct democracy, it's much more than a representative government, and it cannot be limited to just a representative government using some forms of direct democracy from the top. And secondly, modern direct democracy is an important step to a genuine representative democracy. And that's, in a way, the vision or the looking forward perspective for all of us. In a genuinely representative democracy, all votes are counted on election day, and all voices are heard every day. This leads towards a society of happy losers. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias a Bruno Kaufmann.